So in part one, we talked about some definitions of the gifted, including Minnesota's definition, Susan Weinbrenner's really brief definition, and some of this sort of the traits that I wanted to mention. I should point out that even though the federal government does not mandate gifted services, there is a federal definition of gifted that's in the statutes. There's also a federal grant program for gifted ed called Javits Funds that is always in danger of not being funded. So that is certainly something that's out there. We aren't going to waste time on it because it's beyond what we need for this class, but there is also a federal definition. So who are the gifted? First of all, the gifted are very diverse. Gifted students come from every possible background. And this is important for you to recognize and for you to share with others because there is a misconception about gifted learners. And the misconception is that gifted learners are overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly middle or upper class students. That is not true. Gifted learners are diverse. They come from all backgrounds. They come from all races and ethnic groups. They come from all genders and gender identities. They come of all sexual orientations. They come from all socioeconomic statuses. They are in some cases very poor. In some cases they are middle class. In some cases they are wealthy, and everything in between. They come from different family structures. They come from foster care. They come from single parent families. They come from two parent families. They come from any possible family structure. And they have a variety of backgrounds, including a variety of home languages. They may or may not speak English at home. And also, they may or may not have some other exceptionality. They may have a hearing or a vision issue. They may have ADHD or a learning disability. So the gifted are an incredibly diverse group. Gifted students in your future school, that group of gifted learners should reflect the population of your school as a whole. If for some reason it doesn't, then your school is doing something wrong. And I don't say that lightly because I don't like to judge schools. People judge schools too often and too harshly. But there is a tendency in gifted education by some to try to make it very exclusive and to say we are only going to let 1% of our students be identified as gifted, or only 2% be identified as gifted. In my opinion, that is not appropriate. The research indicates that at least 3 to 5% of a classroom, or classrooms can be small, so let's say 3 to 5% of a school's population should be considered gifted. Some research indicates that should be much higher, and they may say actually 10% or more. Remember too, it's okay that a child that is gifted and needs extra challenge in your school may not need extra challenge in another school. That just happens, and that's okay too. We do know that some groups, despite giftedness being very diverse, are underrepresented in gifted classrooms. And that can include children of color. It can include children in poverty. But a particularly underrepresented group are twice exceptional learners. These are learners who have some identified exceptionality, particularly a learning disability. But it could also be autism. It could also be an emotional disorder. It could also be ADHD. It could be a physical issue. It could be a communications issue. It could be a sensory issue in terms of being deaf or hard of hearing, or having blindness or visual impairment. Any of those learners can also be gifted, and it's a little bit easier for those students to sort of fall through the cracks. Who aren't necessarily the gifted? These are the groups that we tend to think of as gifted. And so here's the dirty little secret of gifted education. In many school districts that have gifted services, the primary way that children are identified as needing gifted services are because teachers nominate them. And teachers tend to nominate students who meet these categories. They tend to nominate teacher pleasers. In other words, what does that mean? Those are the kids we like to teach. They are the kids who always have their hand up, but not too much. They don't want to overlook anyone else, but they are willing to answer. They're willing to answer hard questions. They are the kids who want to help us pass out papers. They are the kids who like to come to school. They are the kids who we are always happy to see in our class. And these are really good kids in many respects, but that doesn't mean they're gifted. Similarly for high achievers, I mentioned this a little bit in the previous video. Just because a child has straight A's doesn't mean they're gifted. You have to think about how easily are those straight A's coming to them. And then school fans. Lots of gifted kids don't like school. They have learned to associate school with boredom and lack of challenge. And students with actively involved families. This is a really, really, really common misconception that, the only reason that they're gifted is because their families are involved in the school. I actually had an assistant superintendent basically say that to me once. Completely untrue. Certainly, some students who are gifted do have actively involved families, but there are other students who are gifted who do not for a variety of reasons. So when you as a teacher are asked if you are fortunate enough to be at a school that actually cares about all students and has gifted services, and you're asked, hey, do you have any of your students who you think would benefit from gifted services? Think about those students who are not challenged enough in your class. And that's not because you're not being a great teacher, you are. But because you are focused on meeting all needs, including the needs of kids who are well below grade level, it is hard to meet the needs of kids who need challenge. And so those kids who are not challenged in your class, that might in fact cause them to not be high achievers because they don't try anymore, because they've been bored, not necessarily just in your class, but in classes for years and years and years. These are the kids you need to look for. I want to take a few minutes to talk a little about the history of gifted education in America and explain why it's in the sorry state it is and why it's been in a sorry state for most of American history. So basically, we're going to make some generalizations. And the generalizations of American education over the years has been two things. We say that we want excellent schools, and we say that because we compare test scores. We compare test scores at a national level when we compare American scores in reading or math or geography or history or science or something else with other countries around the world. We increasingly do that at a state and local level when we compare test scores between buildings in a single district or between districts. So we say we want excellent schools. We also say we want equity in schools. And oftentimes, rather than equity, we might even say equality. And equity and equality, as you know, probably aren't the same thing. These two desires in American education are not always congruent. They don't always work well together. And so it's been argued by some that American education has gone back and forth and has been a tug-of-war between this desire for excellence and a desire for equity. And so what do we know about giftedness? Well, we can look at some important figures. And I want to begin with Sir Francis Galton, who is an older figure. And I also want you to know, if you look up Francis Galton, you will find that he stood for lots of things that nobody stands for today. I want to be really clear about that. He argued that there is a high genetic component of intelligence in a book called Hereditary Genius. And that has been misused, including by him, if I remember correctly, to try to perpetuate racist stereotypes about learners who aren't white. And those stereotypes are obviously inaccurate. And Galton was flat out wrong with that. But he was correct that there is a high genetic component of intelligence, regardless of race or ethnicity. We know from modern twin studies that intelligence has a significant genetic component, that from 75 to 80% of intelligence can be traced to genetics, to inheritance, as opposed to environment. Lewis Terman, sometimes called the father of gifted education, did a longitudinal study of just over 1,500 gifted children. These were highly gifted children. Their IQ scores were over 135. And so, taking back to when we talked about IQ a few weeks ago, IQ, as typically defined, especially in Terman's day, is mental age divided by chronological age. So an IQ of times 100. So an IQ of 135, for example, would mean that a 10-year-old would have a mental age of 13 and a half. So in other words, a beginning fifth grader, let's say they turned 10 at the start of fifth grade, would mentally be operating at the level of somebody halfway through eighth grade year. Here's the most important finding of Terman. And longitudinal study over time, like over decades. Acceleration is important. What does acceleration mean? Basically, it means skipping grades. And we don't like that as teachers. Maybe, I shouldn't say we, because I like it as a teacher. Many teachers don't like that, and they don't like it for a few reasons, which we'll talk about when we'll talk about acceleration more. But I want you to know right now that Terman had thoughts and things that would get him canceled today, I'm pretty sure. But the importance of acceleration is borne out by research, period. And what we know is that when students aren't accelerated, when gifted students aren't accelerated, they get poor work habits. And so that is how you get a sixth grader, a seventh grader, a high school student who, even though they are very, very intelligent, are failing their classes or are barely getting by with C's because they have developed poor work habits. Gifted education is not a new thing. In the late 19th century, various schools around the country started acceleration programs, and they started what's called tracking. Now, tracking is a very bad thing when we're talking about children of average and below average intelligence, but tracking is a very good thing for kids who are gifted. And this is what's important to remember. People are individuals, and education, in order to be equitable, to be truly equitable, needs to do what's best for each learner. And so there are practices that aren't appropriate for 95% of our students, and so we shouldn't do them for 95% of our students. But they are appropriate for 5% of our students. And so it's important that we do what's appropriate for that 5%, even if that looks different than what we do for the other 95%. By 1920, at least 2/3 of larger cities in the US actually had gifted programs. This declined after 1920 for a couple of reasons. The 1920s were considered sort of historically in American culture the age of the common man, using the old-fashioned term for man, meaning all humans, the age of the common person. Critics call this the age of mediocrity. And they argued that everyone should be at the same standard. Does that word sound familiar? Standard? I will quote a former history professor of mine, a late history professor of mine, that a standardized education is a mediocre education. Now, this decline was exacerbated during the Great Depression, when there was no funding for schools, basically at all. Another key figure, more recently, post-World War II, I believe, but still quite a ways back now, 1940s, 1950s, is Lita Hollingworth. And she's sometimes called the nurturant or nurturing mother of gifted education. And her research argued that the gifted children and young adults are the original thinkers of their generation. But they require special instruction. They need instruction to help them develop the attitudes and the drives that are related to productive habits and leadership. Because if they don't have that instruction, they will develop unproductive habits, including laziness. She worked a lot on emotional education, including gifted counseling. We know, of course, that all children benefit from counseling, all children benefit from social emotional learning, but there has been lots of research on the social emotional needs of gifted students, and those aren't always the same as the social emotional needs of their chronological peers. And gifted students' social needs and emotional needs are very much underappreciated in schools. Even today, more schools now are engaging in social emotional learning, and many of you will be either in a field experience or in your student teaching. The school that you're in will talk about how they do social emotional learning, which is a good thing. But often that's generic social emotional learning, and it doesn't meet specifically the needs of children who are gifted. So I mentioned this in the last video. Hollingworth found that students whose IQs were over 140 waste half of their class time. And super high IQs over 170. And these are incredibly rare, and you may have a child like this once or twice in your teaching career in a typical school. But they spend their time in what she called bizarre and wasteful activities. And students with high IQs become apathetic and develop negative attitudes towards authority figures. Back to history a little bit. We did see increased interest in educational excellence when the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, launched Sputnik. Sputnik was the first human-made satellite, the first artificial satellite, and it was of grave concern in the United States that our arch nemesis in the Cold War was going to win what was called the space race. And this led to a renewed focus on academic excellence, particularly involving science and math, that lasted for about 5 years. And then it went away. There was a brief rekindling of this interest in the 1970s, and it too went away. What's the state of education and gifted education today? It's not great. And it hasn't been great since No Child Left Behind in 2001. So most of you who are listening to this video, for your lifetimes, the state of gifted education in the U.S. has been pretty bad. No Child Left Behind is really what brought widespread testing in schools. There was certainly testing before No Child Left Behind. I, for example, taught in Las Vegas in 1995. We did yearly curriculum-based tests in Las Vegas for, at the very least, reading and math. I can't remember now if we did science and social studies or not. That were important, that they were reported in the paper and other things, but they were high stakes in one way, but they weren't in another, because the school was probably not going to lose their accreditation over them and teachers weren't going to get fired over them. No Child Left Behind, among other things, mandated widespread testing. That has not gone away. It has changed a little bit over the years, and some of the consequences have changed, but we remain for the past 20 plus years now in a test-driven environment. And because of that, schools' concern is on getting children to pass the test. And so when you're teaching 6th grade and you have a 6th grader who comes in and could pass those tests on the first day of school, you as a teacher are probably not going to give that child a lot of attention, because your focus is on those kids who are working at a 3rd or 4th grade level, not at a child who's working at a 10th grade level. That's incredibly understandable, but it also doesn't meet that child's needs, and that's a problem. We also in American society have a pervasive belief that is incredibly inaccurate, that everyone is gifted in his or her own way, and that's simply not true. Everybody has strengths and everybody has weaknesses, but it's not true that everyone is gifted, as defined by the federal government or as defined by the state of Minnesota. Giftedness is being well ahead of your similarly situated peers in terms of age, in terms of culture and background, in either your academic abilities or achievement, in your intellectual abilities, in your leadership skills, or in your creativity. It is certainly possible that many people are gifted in ways that are not related to how academically gifted is traditionally defined, but it's untrue that everyone is gifted. But beyond that, all students, whether they are in preschool or seniors in high school, have 2 rights. They have lots of rights, but 2 things I would argue they deserve is that they deserve to learn and they deserve to be challenged. So why do we have gifted services? We have them to develop every learner's strengths. Now, for our kids who are not gifted, we in the regular classroom develop their strengths just fine. And this is true too for kids who are working a little above grade level in a typical average, mythically average school. So if I'm teaching 5th grade in a mythical school where most of my students are on grade level, let's say COVID hasn't happened, because COVID has messed everything up, as we all know. But let's say this is either pre-COVID or it's so far down the road that COVID is just a distant bad memory. And so I'm in a school where most of my 5th graders are around grade level. Now that means when I say around, some of them are kind of working at a 4th grade level and some of them are working at a 6th grade level. But they're all around 5th grade. And I'm going to have some students, though, in this mythical school that are working below grade level, right? I'm going to have some students who are at a 2nd or 3rd grade level. I might have some students who are lower than that. And these are often students who will receive special ed services or who will receive intervention services. But what about my students on the other end? What about my students who are working at an 8th or 9th or 10th grade level? These are my students that don't get attention paid to them. Think about if you want to be If you're getting your pre-primary endorsement, you would like to teach early childhood or kindergarten or first grade. Picture your kindergarten classroom. What will you do with that child who comes to you on the first day of kindergarten and they are reading at a second grade reading level? Whereas for most of your class may not even know their alphabet yet, depending on your school. That child who's already reading still deserves to learn in school. We know that gifted services are increasingly being seen as a civil rights issue. Now, this has actually gotten pushed aside a little bit recently, but in my earlier research, there was quite a few articles, at least some articles, research articles back in the 1990s that were arguing this, where they were pointing out that particularly in diverse schools, in high poverty schools or in minority majority schools where gifted services often weren't being available, that it was a civil rights issue because those high ability students, regardless of background, still deserve gifted services. And equity. Equity is not treating everyone the same, it's treating everyone fairly. We value equity. I started this presentation with that. Part of valuing equity is making sure that all of our students learn, that all of our students are challenged in school, challenged appropriately. There is a myth that gifted students will make it on their own. And it's easy to understand that because you as a teacher, again, you're teaching 8th grade and you have kids who can barely read your textbook. And then you have those kids who you could give a college textbook to and they would understand it perfectly. And your natural inclination as a caring teacher is to help students get to grade level. And you have this thought perhaps, well, my students who are working well above grade level, they'll be okay because they already know it. The problem is that what we're doing in cases like that is we're really holding them back. We are making them relearn things over and over and over again. And we are still expecting them we are requiring them to succeed in spite of an educational system that is designed to frustrate them. But beyond that, beyond sort of the ethical implications of that, they don't succeed. So if overall about 3 to 5%, maybe 3 to 8% of the population is considered gifted, 10 to 20% of high school dropouts are gifted. Beyond that, over half of gifted students don't match ability with achievement. They're called underachievers. And they're underachievers because they have been ignored by schools. And I don't blame individual teachers for that because there is not sufficient support, because Minnesota does not require gifted education. Even states that require gifted education do a bad job implementing it. And frankly, colleges are to blame as well. Your gifted knowledge in a teacher ed program is typically 1 week or so in a course like this spent on gifted issues. Now, I don't know. I'm new still. I don't know all the ins and outs of BSU's program. So maybe you spend a lot of time on gifted issues in other courses. If you do, that's great. And it's also really unusual. Typically, a course like this is the only course where you talk about kids who are gifted. Now, it's also true that we don't do a great job of kids with other special needs. But at least in teacher ed programs, at least occasionally, in other courses, we talk about kids with other special needs. We talk about kids who have a learning disability. We talk about kids who are English learners. We talk about children who are coming to us in poverty, all of which cause special educational needs. And those often are discussed throughout courses in a typical teacher education program. But gifted students aren't. And that's not just a Bemidji State problem, that's not just a Min State problem. Although I think it is a problem in both of those places, it is really a national problem. That teachers aren't given enough support from the beginning on how to help gifted children. I want to remind you that tomorrow's promise, tomorrow's leaders are in today's schools. The answers to problems in global society, in American society, in local society may very well be in our classrooms today. But we as teachers are responsible for helping all of our students build on their strengths, including those students who come to us already with extensive strengths. Thanks for listening. In our next video, we will talk more about what it means to be gifted.